Hey everybody, welcome to Midweek. Tonight we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 13, Genesis chapter 14, Genesis chapter 18, and Genesis chapter 19. And so as you can see, we have a lot to talk about today, and that's because we're continuing our series and we're going to be talking about Abraham and Lot. And as we start, you think about sibling rivalries. I know some of us grew up with some of those. And, in the Bible, there are a few sibling rivalries. You've got Isaac and Ishmael, even in the book of Genesis, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, and Esau. You've got Joseph, who had a rivalry with like all his brothers. And, then you had Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. There was an interesting story even there because at the end of Jacob, slash Israel, that was his name at the end of his life, when he wanted to bless, his descendants, there's a famous kind of story, Genesis chapter 48, verse 14, where Joseph is trying to get him to bless the one son over the other, and so basically Jacob or Israel, he purposely switches his hands, crisscrosses them across his body, and puts his right hand on the child that was put on his left knee. Anyways, sibling rivalries are a big deal, and in our times and in the Bible. And it's interesting because God doesn't always do what is expected culturally, and I think sometimes you see that the older one was blessed, sometimes the younger was blessed. But as we think about sibling rivalries, what's interesting to me in studying out Genesis 13, 14, 18, and 19 is to see Abram and Lot really as a contrasting pair. I've been very familiar with Jacob and Esau, but to think about Abram and Lot as a little bit of a rivalry, I never really saw it that way. But as I read, you see it a little bit more. We know a lot about Abraham and not a lot about Lot. So who was Lot? Lot was Abraham's nephew. He is Abraham's brother Haran's son, and they lived together for many years, and Abraham and Lot even traveled together from Ur of the Chaldeans to Canaan, so they spent a lot of time together. Genesis 11:31 says, Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So you see that, Abram and Lot are related. They're traveling with Abram's dad, Lot's granddad. Then we see Genesis 12, 4 through 5. It says, So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. After a brief side plot story in Egypt, Abram and Lot return to Canaan. So they go there initially after this long journey that had a pit stop in Haran. They go from Ur to Haran to Canaan. Then there's a famine, and so there's this side plot. They go out to Egypt. Some crazy stuff happens there, deception, and they eventually Abram and Lot return to Canaan. And here we have the first in a trilogy of Lot stories. Do you like trilogies? I know I like trilogies. I love Star Wars. You got Lord of the Rings. Well, here we have the trilogy of Abram and Lot. And in each story, we learn about Abraham. I'll use Abraham and Lot interchangeably. Here we learn about Abraham and Lot. So let's look at story number 1. Story number 1 is Genesis 13, and this is where Abram and Lot separate. They come back to Canaan. They had just been in Egypt, and they had each amassed livestock and herds. They were successful in accumulating wealth, and then basically disputes break out between their herdsmen. And let me stop and actually just say for a second, I'm going to be summarizing a lot of stuff, so feel free to go back and read the scriptures on this and study it out for yourself. But there was a dispute between their herdsmen. It was kind of like an old Western, right? It's like, this town ain't big enough for the both of us. And so there was some quarreling over grazing rights for their animals. Now, you'd have thought this was a good thing, right? Good problems, right? They had some good problems, as we say, some first world problems. Basically their flocks, their herds were too large. They were getting too successful. They were starting to step on each other's toes, and they had to figure out a plan to work for each of them. And so Abram approaches Lot to resolve things between them. He even lets Lot have first pick over what land he gets. It reminded me of a coin toss in the football game that starts off the football game. And it's kind of like, they flip the coin and it's like, okay, Abram, you've won the toss. Abram defers, he gives it to Lot, and then Lot gets to make the choice. It also reminds me a little bit of when you're splitting food, right? You ever done that before where to make it fair, one person will split the food and the second person chooses the food? And so here, Abram does the splitting and he says, you can go that way or that way, and Lot does the choosing. But here we start to see the contrast in character between Abram and Lot. We see Abram as a peacemaker. He's known to be a peacemaker. And we see that he's gracious, he's thoughtful, and he's considerate. Abram is righteous. It's important for Abram to be in right relationship with those around him, especially people of his own house and his own family. It reminds me of the scripture in the New Testament that says, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with all people. And I think it's also magnified by the fact that it wasn't just Lot and Abram competing for the land, but it says that also there were Canaanites and Perizzites living there. So Abram deferring to Lot, giving him first choice, that was a big deal. And that showed Abram's confidence, his peacemaking skills, his magnanimity, his graciousness. It showed really the character of Abram. Abram is clearly the bigger person. Now Lot, on the other hand, is passive. You look at this story, and if you go back and you read Genesis 13, he has no speaking lines. He just looks around, and he looks at the land, and he chooses his pick, and then he leaves. You don't see a thank you, Abram, or, there's no mushy-gushy stuff. There's no hugging. At least that's not what it says. Maybe there was, and then just didn't put it in there. But here's what's interesting. Look at Abram's language in Genesis chapter 13, verse 8 through 9. It says, "So Abram said to Lot, 'Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left.' They had the whole land before them, and Abram posed the choice of left or right. Now, some scholars believe that they may have been facing east, and there's, a fairly decent case for this. And if this was correct, then at their backs to the west would have been the Mediterranean Sea. So really that wasn't an option. Not, much places you can go that way. So another way that he could have said it would have been, look, if you go north, Lot, I'll go south. And if you go south, I'll go north. Because those would have still fallen within the land of Canaan. And with the two choices from Abram, north or south, Lot chooses not north, not south. Lot chose east. Lot chose back the way they had come from, back towards the land God had called them out of. Genesis 13:10 through 13 says, Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Some not so subtle foreshadowing there. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. At the time, the east was looking really good. It says that it looked like the Garden of Eden. But the reader and the listener, and we know, it's like when you know the ending of a movie as it's happening, we knew something was gonna go down. And that beautiful land would end up a wasteland. It's kind of in today's term, it would be like buying tons of stocks in a company that looked like the sure bet, the sure thing. And then later on the company tanks and you lost all your money. And so as we will see, Sodom was not a good bet for Lot. It was not such a good investment. And that's what sin does, though. It looks enticing. It looks beautiful and fulfilling, but it leaves you empty and desolate. Lot's choice separates him from Abram. And here we get introduced to the people of Sodom. Now, Sodom already had a reputation of wickedness, as we will come to see. But before we get into all that, just a side note, biblically, the direction east was an ominous direction. Adam and Eve, it says, left the Garden of Eden and went to the east. Cain went east. The Babylonites found a plain to the east. Now, one very, very important note on this. This is not a statement about anything in today's world. There's nothing sinful or wrong about the East in today's world. You know, the world is round. If you really think about it, we are currently all east of somewhere. It was simply a device used by the Genesis author. Biblically, it's a signpost to tell us that someone is going astray. And so truly we see that Lot had gone astray. You know, while Abram values God and his promised land, Lot is enticed by the forbidden land on the periphery. And so he pitches his tents near Sodom. So again, we see this contrast between Abram and Lot. Abram lived in Canaan, and Lot lived near Sodom. We're going to come back to that later. You know, Lot reminds me of that curious person. We all know this person, right? They know what the right thing to do is. But man, it looks fun. You know, what those people out in the world are doing. And they think like, I want to just be close enough to kind of feel a little bit and be around that atmosphere a little bit. I don't want to do it, but I want to kind of be around it. What about us? You know, it's this idea of really playing with the line, flirting with that line, being okay with getting as close to it as possible. You know, we have to think about what links are we clicking on. Right now, we are under stay-at-home orders. Some people are quarantined, and you have a lot of time to yourself. What links are we clicking on? What Netflix shows are we watching? What movies are we watching? Do we check the ratings of the movies we watch before we watch them? Whose pages are we scrolling through? What accounts are we looking at and why? Who are we Facebook stalking right now? Right? We need to stay far away from things that will take us away from God. See, the Bible makes it clear that Abram is why Lot prospers. Abram was the reason for Lot's blessing in Genesis 13. Abram equals blessed. That's what the Bible says. And so Lot's separation from Abram, therefore, means a separation from blessing. And this is shown case in point in story number 2. So let's keep it moving. I hope you're still with me. We have a lot to get through. Story number 2. In Genesis 14, we see Abram rescues Lot. You know, this is a really interesting chapter. And some commentaries I've read, it talks about this being a very mysterious chapter. It almost seems out of place in the Bible. And it tells us about a war between kings. There's a war, there's a battle right here in Genesis 14, and there are 2 coalitions of kings. It's strange because these things are going on outside of kind of the biblical narrative of these people of faith. Life was going on around God's people as they were being called to different places. And so you had 4 kings who were in power, and then you had 5 kings who were oppressed by those 4 kings, and they decided after I think it was 13 years, they were like, we're gonna rebel. So this was 5 against 4, right? If you're thinking like a basketball game, half court, clearly the advantage is with the 5 people. You would think the larger number would win. But no, we look at the story and it says the oppressed kings, though they had the numbers on their side, they remained subject to the oppressors. And it says that it was so bad that their men fell into tar pits on their retreat in the battle. It's almost as if the land itself was fighting against them. That's how bad they got a beat down. You know, this was an inauspicious location for the 5 kings, to say the least, to have a battle because these tar pits were all there. And so one of the defeated kings was Bela, king of Sodom. So obviously we've been introduced a little bit to Sodom. And so we learn something very interesting. We learn a development here. And so let's look at Genesis 14:11 through 12. It says, the 4 kings seized all of the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food. Then they went away. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. We learn here that Lot is captured along with all of his possessions. So one of the results of this war that was waged and the losing party, Sodom being one of the 5 kings who lost, is that now Lot is taken captive. And we also learn by association, the other knowledge, not only was Lot taken captive, but the reason he was taken captive was because Lot was living in Sodom. Lot went from living near to living in Sodom. And so Abram gets the news of Lot's capture. At once he gathers his forces. Pretty amazing how many people he's able to muster. It's like 318 or something like that. And some pretty big number. You're like, wow, that's a pretty big force. And he attacks. Abram gathers a force. He actually has a coalition of some other people, Mamre and these guys that live near him. And he attacks the kings that the other 5 kings couldn't beat. And it was a sneak attack. It was a night ambush that was often used by smaller groups to give them a better chance to win in battle. And in Genesis 14, verse 16, it says, he recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. Again, we see Lot here as a weak figure. He was taken captive. I'm not even sure if he really fought in the battle. It doesn't say he was taken captive in the battle. It's possible that Lot didn't even fight. It's possible he was still in Sodom and was captured after the battle. That's what, at least the way I read it. Again, Lot has no speaking lines in this passage as well. And you don't see, a thank you, Abram, for coming and risking your life, risking your neck to rescue me. We see that Lot is passive and he is impotent. That means not powerful. And in contrast, you got Abram. Abram is this mighty warrior leading an army, mustering forces, going out by night, strategizing and winning the battle, fighting for noble causes. Abram didn't fight for money. He didn't fight for possessions. Abram fought because he heard that his relative had been taken captive. His whole motive was to rescue Lot. It was a rescue mission. The same guy who ditched him to go live in Sodom. As a side note, when Abram returns from rescuing Lot, he encounters 2 kings in the Valley of the Kings after a war of the kings. A lot of kings going on here. And these 2 kings that he encounters are Melchizedek, who is the king of Salem, and Bela, the king of Sodom. Now, one king blesses him, and the other king's first words to Abram are, "Give me." And there's so much more here than we have really time to look at. There's some very interesting stuff. A lot of speculation has gone into Melchizedek and who is he, and you can look into Hebrews, and there's a psalm that connects Hebrews and Genesis here. But Melchizedek, that name, Melchizedek, it meant king of righteousness. And then Salem meant peace. And so he was the king of Salem, this place. So he was both the king, literally both the king of righteousness and the king of peace. And I think what this shows us is makes sense. And I know this probably goes without saying, but righteousness and peace go hand in hand. When we are righteous, it leads us to a place of peace. It doesn't mean that just because we're righteous, we're never going to have any stress. But overall, it means that there is a confidence that the righteous have and a peace of heart and mind that the righteous have. On the other hand, there's no peace with the king of Sodom, only sin and defeat. Abram shows his character in his interactions with the 2 kings. And we see that he refuses to be indebted to a foreign king for success. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the king of Sodom. He won't even take any of the goods or possessions. He's like, I don't want anybody to say that my success could be attributed to anybody but God. God is his provider. Abram here is both faithful and noble. So let's move on to story number 3. I hope you're still with me. So in Genesis chapter 18 and 19, this is a long part of the passage. I'm going to summarize a lot of stuff. A lot of things is common knowledge, but I'd encourage you to go back and re-examine and look at it a little bit more. And here we see the actual account of Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed. And we also see an interesting encounter between Abram and visitors. There's a contrast between Abram and Lot going on here. Now, both men are visited. There are visitors. Abraham is visited at his tent in Canaan. By the way, side note, Abraham was a champion social distancer, right? Living out in tents far away from the city. So he would have been a natural. He'd have been doing really well right now. And Lot, on the other hand, was a city dweller. But anyways, so Abraham was visited at his tent in Canaan. Lot was visited in Sodom by two visitors, but we know it was the same. Two of the people were the same in both instances. And so Abraham is shown in his visit to be an excellent host. As soon as he sees he has guests, he looks up from the entrance of his tent. It says he hurried out to meet them. He ran towards them. He bowed to the ground. He sets up his household to go to work. He starts asking people, servants and Sarah and different people to do things, making food, serving them. He recognized that they were important, special, divine visitors. Lot, on the other hand, is not a great host. And he is clearly shown as an inferior host to Abraham. And it takes him a while to recognize that his visitors aren't ordinary men. While Abraham is immediately responsive, Lot is resistant and slow. We're going to move on. We'll come back to that contrast between Abraham and Lot there. But let's talk about Sodom a little bit, because there's a lot of preconceived notions about Sodom and the sin that went on there. It's so infamous that it has a name associated. The wickedness of Sodom was great. And it was so great that God wanted to investigate it himself. It says that he wanted to go down there. It reminds us a lot of the Tower of Babel, that he went down. Let me go down and see what's going on. Again, we see God went down to Sodom and Gomorrah. This time, not such a good thing. And often, the sin that gets highlighted in the story with Sodom and Gomorrah is homosexuality. However, we see more than just that in this passage. We don't have time to get into all of it, but Sodom's real sin was social injustice. God was concerned with how they were treating people, how they treated foreigners. Aliens had protections in the Israelite law. When you read on further in the books of the law, they had protections on the basis that the Israelites themselves were once foreigners and strangers when they had left Egypt. It talks about that. You could look it up in Exodus 23, verse 9. We even see this was a well-known thing amongst the prophets, even Ezekiel, when the prophet describes the sin of Sodom. Ezekiel 16, verse 49. It says, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant," so there's some pride going on there. "They were overfed and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy." Wow. That's pretty convicting, because that's not honestly what we usually think of when we think of the sin of Sodom. But here I see pride, arrogance, selfishness, a concern for self, not helping the poor and the needy, and taking advantage of people. Clearly, the people in Sodom mistreated the foreigners in their midst. This was a city that had a reputation, and there was a great outcry going out, so much that God heard it. This was the city, though, think about that. This was the city where Lot chose to live. So when we read the story, it's a little hard to see Lot as a good guy. You're kind of like, man, you got yourself into this. We read the story and you see he protects these two strangers from sexual assault, but instead offers his virgin daughters to the mob. It's very confusing. It's very odd. It seems very strange that you would even think of Lot as a righteous person. It seems that the longer Lot lived in Sodom, the more of Sodom lived in Lot. And so it's very confusing, this idea that even that Lot would be spared. It seems like he's kind of just as wicked as the rest of them. However, the Genesis author is probably more focused on the fact that Lot was showing care and concern and compassion and towards the strangers, the two visitors. And that really being a testament to his character, that he was treating the poor and the needy well, because right treatment of the disadvantaged was really a badge of the righteous. The righteous were people that would take care of those who were in need. And so, even so, Lot here is not exactly the paragon of virtue. Again, compared to Abraham, he's, not doing so hot. Compared to the people of Sodom, he was probably the most upstanding citizen there. Compared to the Sodomites, he was a valiant guy. But compared to Abram, he's clearly not the legitimate heir of God's promises. Now, here's what's interesting. At the start of the Genesis 19 story, where did the angels find Lot? Genesis 19 verse 1 says, "The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground." Where was Lot? It says that he was sitting in the gateway of the city. And this is really important. I don't know for us if we see the same kind of significance, because a lot has changed. We're not living in an ancient culture. And, when we drive through places and drive into new cities and stuff, I mean, I guess we're going through the tolls or whatever, or we're going, under tunnels over bridges. But the city gate in ancient times, this was a very important place. This is where everyone exited and entered into and out of the city. This is where people heard disputes. This is where there would be an arbiter. Somebody would be there that would kind of adjudicate civil disagreements. Often, this is where the community leaders would stand. It's a visible place. It's a social place where people were walking in and out. Think about, if you know the story about David and Absalom. Absalom chose to go stand at the city gate, and that's where he kind of incited an insurrection against David by winning people over. The city gate was a place where people got to know you. You got to know people. And so it's possible that Lot's position at the gate put him in an influential role in the community of Sodom. It shows that he was pretty ingrained in this community. He had become a part of it. Further, it's interesting getting deeper into the text. If you look behind the English, the Hebrew word for sitting, yoseb, comes from the same word for staying or for living, yasab. And so it's almost like in a few short chapters, Lot goes from living, yasab, in Canaan with Abram, to living, yasab, near Sodom, to living in Sodom, to then yoseb, to sitting or to living in the gate. He goes from being so far away from sin to being right in the middle and right in the thick of it. And the crazy thing is, Lot had so many choices. You might say he had lots of choices to change his trajectory. However, at each point, he chose to get closer and closer to sin. And that's how sin is. It starts with curiosity, right? And, there's a curiosity, well, what's going on there? I wonder, there's a little, prick or an excitement in our hearts. There's this thing, there's temptation. And it starts with that curiosity, but then there's a deceit. Maybe you engage in something, and then there's a deceit of even not wanting to share that I even had that temptation, maybe. And so then choosing not to confess. And then it moves to a lack of openness. And little by little, people start to drift further and further from God, until one day they wake up like Lot in Sodom at the gate, fully engaged and entrenched in sinful practices, wondering, how did I even get here? We have to be careful not to fall into the trap that Lot did. Lot got a little too socially distant, if you know what I mean. A little too socially distant from Abraham and from God. Social distancing is very important. We're encouraging this. We're trying to help people. We're trying to stop spread of disease. We're trying to save lives. This is important to help our world combat coronavirus, but we've got to remain relationally connected. As someone has said recently, I've heard this said, we want to remain socially distant, but not spiritually distant. And in this time, we have to work extra hard to keep people aware of what's going on in our lives. You got to realize that Satan will try to draw you in. I would say Satan is already trying to draw you in. The same way he drew in Lot. He wants to tempt you. He wants to bring you down. He wants to bring you closer to your destruction. Little by little, he wants to pull you out of the circle of God's blessing and out of the promised land. We've talked a lot tonight about geography and about location. We saw that Lot moved closer and closer geographically to Sodom until he was right up in the middle of that thing, all up in there. But another view on it, if you think about it, Lot went from this fertile plain, then he went to a city, and eventually he ends up in a cave. And that's kind of spoiling the end of the story. We're not even going to get there at the end of Genesis chapter 19. You can go read it. It's kind of twisted, some of the stuff that happens there. But basically, the point of all that is that sin will take you to places that you do not want to go. You do not want to be in that cave. So just don't go there. I think that's the lesson of Lot. Don't go there. Now, there's not enough time to go into too much detail about Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed, but that's the long story short. Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed, Lot was spared, and the passage ends with one verse that connects the whole episode to God's encounter with Abraham back in Genesis 18. And Genesis 19 verse 21 is what that verse is. It says, "So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived." The scripture seems to suggest that Lot was spared on account of Abraham. And earlier in Genesis 18, we see this dialogue. Verse 29, it harkens back, it reminds us of Genesis 18 and this dialogue that Abraham had with God. God reveals to Abraham, it's very interesting. He's like, should I tell Abraham about this? Well, he is the guy that I've chosen. I'm going to bless all the nations through Abraham. So let me tell him, I should let him in on this. I want him to be great. I want to make sure he knows about this. And so God reveals that Sodom and Gomorrah would likely be destroyed. He doesn't say for sure. He just says the outcry has been so loud and so it's come to me. I got to go down and check this out. But Abraham wasn't stupid. Abraham knew what was going on in Sodom. And so Abraham knew, yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah, they are probably not going to last here. But Abraham also knew that my relative Lot is down there. As much as Lot had, whatever little he really did for Abraham or whatever rivalry there was between them, Abraham always had Lot's good in mind. He cared about him. And so he was confronted really with two things that seemed very incongruent. And those two things are God's justice, but then also God's mercy. That God is completely just, that he's going to give people what they deserve, that there's fairness, but then also God's mercy, that he's forgiving, or that he lets people, he gives grace. See, if the cities were destroyed, then that would mean that innocent people suffered, if there were innocent people living there. But if the cities were spared, then it meant that guilty people were going free and that if there was no punishment. And so this was really kind of a seeming dissonance between these things that Abraham knew about God, that he was both just, but he was also merciful. And so he asks God, well, how many righteous people would it take for you to spare the city on account of? They go back and forth, really interesting. They start with 50, go down to 10, and we could spend a long time on that. But it's amazing the fact that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. It says that they couldn't even really find 10 righteous people there. I mean, that says a lot. But what's interesting is that, whereas there might be option A and B, right? We might look at total destruction or, total saving everybody. God is able to come out with infinite other options. Option C, all the way to option Z, and like a whole other alphabet that we don't even know about. I mean, God is able to do things and work around things and make it so that the people that need to be dealt with, they need to be dealt justice, that is meted out. But that the people who he wants to give mercy to, he's able to spare. And so God was able to do with Sodom and Gomorrah something that, again, didn't even see him on the table. He got Lot and his family out of there. God was able to rescue the righteous. And even though that's questionable to call Lot righteous, and even there you see God's mercy, and yet you see God's justice as well. But he was able to show mercy, rescue people out of Sodom and Gomorrah. And you even see one of the cities in the plains, Zoar, it doesn't end up getting destroyed, even though it was supposed to be, because of an interesting dialogue with Lot, because he didn't feel like he could make it to the mountains. That's a whole other thing. But God was able to be merciful while also executing judgment. And what we see here is also that Lot was rescued by Abraham now twice, right? Rescued twice by Abraham. Once from captivity in Genesis 14, and then another time, once from death in Genesis 19. As we're closing out here, this story of Lot teaches us many important lessons. And just a couple of them I think that I just want to summarize with, very simple, but where we are really matters locationally. And I'm not talking about which apartment you live in or what neighborhood of the city you live in. Wherever you are, in a lot of ways, you can still be in another place spiritually. And I think where you are, where we are matters. Where we are located in our hearts and in our minds, where our head is at, where our heart is at. We've got to make sure that we don't get anywhere close to Sodom the way that Lot did. Also, who we are with matters. Who we choose to surround ourselves with. We've got to be mindful of our surroundings. It reminds me of the scripture, bad company corrupts good character. We've got to think about who are the people that I'm surrounding myself with. We've got to be mindful of these things. When we look at Abraham and Lot, clearly there is one of them who stands out as an example of faith. One of these men is worthy of imitation. So let's choose to follow in the footsteps of Abraham and not go the direction of Lot. As we close here, I just want to leave us with some questions that we can discuss in our life talks and our small groups. And so I'm going to read those questions right now. The first question is, what are some ways that Satan could be, or is trying to draw you into sin during this coronavirus pandemic? So what are some ways Satan could be or is trying to draw you into sin during this coronavirus pandemic? The second question, how have you been blessed by righteous men and women of faith in your life? I think this is a great one to think about, an encouraging thought. How have you been blessed by people? The way that Lot had been blessed just by being associated with Abraham. How have you been blessed by righteous men and women of faith in your life? Number 3, who are the brothers and sisters in your life that you can depend on to intervene on your behalf if you are struggling spiritually, the way that Abraham did for Lot? Who do you trust? Who's got your back? Who is in your circle of close friends? Who are the brothers and sisters? Who are the people that will be praying for you? And also, who can you be that person for? That you would intercede, you would go before God and pray for them, as well as have the talks with that person to try to help them not to go down a road that is going to lead to bad places. And finally, how can you be a blessing to others the way Abraham was to Lot? I hope you found this encouraging. We are praying for all of you, praying for your health and your safety at this time. We love and miss you and can't wait to be back together in person.